demonstrations. The response in America has been really bizarre, authoritarian, draconian. We have curfews every day. We've been having curfews every day since the weekend, and that's very bizarre here in Los Angeles. So, you know, there's...
What are those like, Sandy?
I mean, for me, I live in an area of Los Angeles called Inglewood, so it's quite a bit away from where the demonstrations are happening. That being said, once the curfews are on, you're not allowed to be outside of your house. And so there have been police cars that are moving through the community. So it becomes really nerve-wracking to do even a simple thing like taking a walk in the evening, which has become a thing that I do because of the coronavirus lockdowns. So, I mean, that's very, very strange. And it's also very strange to get the emergency notifications to your phone about the curfews, what time they start, with less than an hour's notice. And that to me seems to be like a tactic to be able to arrest demonstrators. And that makes me very nervous.
I'm curious, are those coming from the federal government or are they coming from the municipal government?
I mean, they don't say, but it says in the update like LA County or LA City. So I imagine that it's coming from a municipal place. And also those curfews have been announced from city to city. So I think it's a municipal decision, though they all got announced on the same day at around the same time. So I do think it's a coordinated municipal decision.
Unbelievable. And as you mentioned, this is all happening amid the epidemic of COVID-19 that is disproportionately killing Black people and people of color. How is this pandemic playing into what we're seeing in the demonstrations, in your view?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a level of desperation that makes the need to demonstrate even more stark, because, you know, people are struggling right now, living in precarity. Perhaps they've lost their jobs, or maybe they're essential workers who've been forced to continue working in dangerous conditions. And then on top of that, anti-Black racism does not end because there's a global pandemic. And that just makes the impact on an individual, like I can't really describe it, like the well of despair and frustration and anger, even more stark. And I mean, I wonder if, because of the fact that some people aren't at work, if that impacts the ability to demonstrate in the street. I certainly think that the compounded experience of, you know, this virus disproportionately harming my community, in addition to these horrific police killings, has an impact on the need to get out into the streets and demonstrate.
It's so strange when you talk about, you know, a 1 p.m. curfew and a 6 p.m. curfew and sudden curfews on top of a shelter in place mandate. Like, how many more ways can there be to keep you inside and keep people closed down? I mean, that must really be making, are people feeling oppressed by that?
I would imagine so. I mean, the California kind of entered phase 1 or phase 2 of reopening last week. And so just before the demonstration started, California started reopening again. And LA has been fantastic in making sure that people have access to testing. They have a situation now where everybody is able to access testing in the city of LA, but they've now just canceled that as part of a response to the demonstrations, which seems like a really terrible public health decision that is aimed at trying to make this more of a dangerous situation for people who are demonstrating. So, you know, it certainly feels extremely oppressive to me.
Do you feel, as a Canadian, I don't know, are you a dual citizen or are you Canadian? Oh,
I'm Canadian.
You're Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a dual citizen, so I have a lot of feelings of, just connectedness to America, and, certainly despair right now. I'm wondering, as a Canadian, do you feel targeted? Do you have that feeling, that you're talking about that of, that sounds like a public health policy meant to target people of color. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I don't think, regardless of my own citizenship, I think that's quite clear, that the ending the ability for people to test themselves at a time when so many people are out on the streets seems like a targeted attack on people who are making the choice to go out and demand better for Black communities. And so I don't understand that decision. It's really disappointing. It's saddening. The LAPD police chief the other day blamed the death of George Floyd on protesters. It just seems like there's a lot of bizarro world stuff going on, and with the people who are in charge out here in America. But we're not immune to that in Canada either.
Right. Well, bizarro is a really apt word to use for the situation right now, but frighteningly so. It's not, we're not watching a movie here, although sometimes it feels like it. And as you say, racism is real in Canada as well. What are you seeing in Canada, and what are you hearing on the ground here?
Obviously, very recently, there were 2 deaths in Toronto, Regis Korchinski-Paquette and DeAndre Campbell, both people who were experiencing a mental health crisis at the time that the police were called. DeAndre Campbell was shot on his front lawn in Peel Region in Brampton, and tased, I believe, and he was unarmed. And Regis Korchinski-Paquette, family called the police for assistance. Her mother heard her crying out for help me mom, and then she plummeted 28 stories to her death and was left outside for hours.
Really?
She was left outside for hours.
I've read this story over and over again, and I'm just like, how can that happen? How can you can't just fall off the balcony. I live in a high rise myself. You don't just fall off the balcony. So what do you think happened? Do you have any idea? Do you have any?
Well, I think it's quite clear from what the family is saying, and they were there witness to what happened, that there seemed to have been some sort of struggle that happened in the apartment, because Regis Korchinski-Paquette was calling out for help before. I lived in a high rise all my life as well. It seems extremely bizarre that what the police are saying happened is that she committed suicide, calls for help, and then commits suicide.
And then runs and.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And what I know is that Toronto police have been caught in lies before, and acting improperly in their interactions with the Black community before. And so I'm inclined to believe the family that's saying, look, something terrible has happened here, and the police are responsible.
And that leads into the question of police and communities and policing that you've spoken to a lot. And you use the term defunding police. And I'm going to just level with you. When I first heard that, I was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
What does that really mean? That didn't sound good to me. But yesterday,
it sounds possible. It sounds bizarre because it is such a accepted truth that we need police in how we're taught to think about safety in our society, but it's actually not so bizarre.
Well, I had a chance to talk to a very brilliant freelance journalist yesterday in Minneapolis. He's on the ground there, and it just happened to come up in the conversation. He said that was a big movement in Minneapolis, and that what it really is, and I'm going to just give it to you in my terms, and then you tell me, because you know so much more about it than I do, but I just want to tell you how I understand it now, is that communities feel like, first of all, like he talked about how in Minneapolis now, neighborhoods are helping each other, and because like the fire trucks are afraid to come to some of the fires and police are afraid to come in some of the areas, that the neighborhoods have begun their own looking out for each other. And so that was one element of it. And then he also talked about how it's really about targeting the problems that underlie crime. And of course, you know, poverty, education, I don't know. Okay, that's my read on it. How did I do, Sandy? And can you please tell us what it really is?
You did pretty good. You did pretty good. I mean, the broad idea, you know, zoomed out is like, let's take, you know, a budget is a statement of priorities. And if like right now, across North America, police budgets are often the #1 thing that municipalities are spending on. And so it looks like our #1 concern is like policing or criminalization. But I think that our #1 concern should be other things like providing safety and security through other means. And I know that people might be listening right now who are like, this seems really difficult to understand. How do we get rid, like you're talking about getting rid of the police or defunding the police, what will that do to safety in a community? My argument is that the police actually don't provide a lot of safety for our community at all. And that there are better ways to provide safety and security to our communities. So one simple example is, you know, something that we've been talking about in Black Lives Matter since our inception. A lot of the police killings that happen in Canada in particular happen when someone is interacting with the police during a mental health crisis.
Yes.
It's so much, that is so much so the truth that in 2014 in Toronto, they released the Yakaguchi report that looked into the Toronto Police Service's interactions with people who are going through mental health crisis. And lo and behold, concluded that the police were ill-equipped to deal with mental health crises, and made a whole host of recommendations which have apparently been implemented and still fail to solve the problem of police using lethal force against people who are having mental health crises. So if the police aren't well equipped to provide safety services in the event of a mental health crisis, why don't we create a new service that people could call? Maybe it's 511, I don't know, that people could call in the event of a mental health crisis, where they're connected to an emergency service, where people are trained in the type of social work needed, the type of health supports that are needed, and attend to that in an emergency function when we call. We know that police aren't good at it. They don't receive the types of trainings that social workers do and health providers do to deal with people who are having mental health issues, and those people wouldn't show up with lethal force. I guarantee we would have, that would be a better service for the people who are going through whatever crisis they're going through in that moment. And that's just one way to think about it. If the police are not providing the service well, let's stop having the police provide the service and create a service that does provide what we need properly.
Let's make a laundry list of all the services that police are called upon to perform in communities right now. And I'll start it, and maybe you can help build on it. And maybe our participants can build on it as well. So you've just listed, basically, they're being called on to be social workers. They're being called on to deal with a mental health crisis. So that's in the realm of psychiatry and social work. They're also being called in to mediate domestic violence situations. Yeah. That's one of their biggest things, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So now they have to be trained for that.
Yeah.
But what if the wrong ones come in? You know, what if they don't have, I don't know how that works.
Well, I mean, what we're touching on there is gender-based violence and violent crime, right? And there, like, I want people to consider the perhaps wild notion that you haven't considered before, that police are actually not good at stopping domestic violence or gender-based violence And quite frankly, they don't prevent those things from happening. Typically,
No.
they come in, and we know that for anyone who's worked in any sort of like women's support service or anything like that, know that the police are terrible at this sort of thing. When the police come in is after a violent crime has already taken place, or after the domestic violence situation has come to a place where someone can reach the phone and can make a call. It's very rare that the police will arrive in the midst of something like that happening. So what we need from whoever is responding to a domestic violence situation are people who are going to be able to support the person who's being victimized, who are going to be sensitive to their needs, who are going to be able to take them to a place where they're going to be safe. I again contend that the police are not the greatest people to do that. There are, again, social workers, people who are trained to deal with gender-based violence situations who will be able to come in and support oftentimes women, but not just only women, who are going through these situations and help them find the support that they need. We also need people to be able to do investigations after a violent crime happens or after some sort of domestic assault situation happens. I still don't understand why that has to be police. There are people who are researchers who have an analysis of all of the different factors that go into domestic violence, gender-based violence, who would be better equipped to do the detective work that needs to be done. And I don't think it has to be the police. And the final note on that, the police are really bad at attending to people who are not the right kind of victims. And so we see in Canada, especially in Indigenous communities, the concerns of Indigenous women, or let's say sex workers, or communities that have been traditionally undervalued by our society. They don't do right by those communities. And that hasn't changed. And I think that we should give these responsibilities to civilian-based agencies that are better equipped to address our needs for safety and security with respect to domestic violence and violent crime.
That makes sense. And
it does, right? It seems so simple. You're like, yeah, you know?
That makes sense. I want to add to the list. I've just been making notes listening to you talk, that the police are called on also, well, they're called on to do conflict resolution. They're called on to do rape counseling. They're called on to inspire youth not to become criminals. In other words, they're called on to deal with gangs in both the negative and the positive way. They're called, and you know, we can't, the problem with drugs, and particularly in America, of course, of like the way the police, you know, come into people's homes and knock down the door and, you know,
they
just
do that.
assault.
They do that in Canada too.
Really?
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't remember the name.
Now I feel like the most naive person in Canada. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, there have been these
and raids. I'm a journalist.
There have been these raids in Toronto, certainly, especially in public housing, to do these drug raids. So, and I'm familiar with people who have experienced them directly. So, no, these are, I mean, the police in Canada are often trained by people from the United States, like they share tactics and so on. So, it's not all that different.
Yeah, I mean, so that's fascinating, and it begs the question of, are the police there? Who are the police there to serve, really? And it gets back to the question or the issue of money. And do you know what the police budget is like in Toronto?
$1.07 billion.
Annually?
This year, I mean, it goes up every single year. I think this year or last year was the first time it surpassed 1 billion. It's more than like the library budget, the public housing budget, and something else combined. I can't remember. And although it looks like it's less than the TTC, if you just look at it on paper, when you take a look at all of the different types of monies that go into the police service, it's actually more spent on the police service than the transit system. And here's another, speaking of the transit system, here's another function that the police serve, right? Where I can like make a really great argument for how defunding the police works. Right now in Toronto and other cities across Canada, I know Calgary, Montreal, I don't know about Vancouver, but the police serve a function as special constables, as they're called in Toronto, of being fair enforcers. So they peruse the transit system, the public transit system, and they check to see if people have paid their fare and have the appropriate proof that they've paid their fare. In Toronto, this has led to incidents of police brutality against young Black people. What if we were to defund the police and take a chunk of that money, put it into the transit system, so the transit system was free? I mean, this is a conversation that's been happening in Toronto. It was a very large conversation in the last municipal election. The transit system was free. Evading fares would not be a crime. You would not need the fare enforcement officers. And we will have just made something so accessible that people who are living in precarity and poverty really need. Because as someone who has myself evaded fares before, I needed to take transit and was super poor and needed to get to work. So you do what you gotta do. Why are we punishing people for being poor? Let's invest in people's security by making transit free. And then guess what? No more crime for evading fares. Don't need the police for that. Save a bunch of money. Isn't that worth it? I think it's worth it.
It's so worth it. And, you know, there's so many things going through my mind right now. But when you say, let's not punish people for being poor, the first thing that comes to my mind is yesterday, again, in my conversation with my Minneapolis journalist friend, he mentioned that, and I hadn't heard this detail, so I cannot confirm that it's true, but he mentioned that George Floyd was paying for something with a fake $20 bill, and that's what he got arrested for. Maybe people on the call can confirm that or not.
The charge is forgery. That much I know is true. Yeah.
He was charged. I knew he was charged with forgery, but when you hear charged with forgery, that's kind of like, well, what was he writing? You know, it's hard to know what that means. But what it evoked for me was the idea of somebody in the middle of the COVID crisis, like in this time of huge economic hardship, is going with a $20 bill to pay for something and gets killed for it. And that is on the proportion of like Les Miserables. That's like you steal a loaf of bread and you work for the rest of your life as a slave or something. You know, it is just so shocking and tragic and so horrible. So back to your thing about transit and safety and money. What you're really talking about are tragedies unfolding in a small way all over Toronto as a result of bad policing. And
or policing at all. Like, I mean, truly, I do not think we need any sort of policing for transit. And I mean, I'm talking about decriminalization, making things no longer crimes as part of the conversation of defunding the police. I mean, we see how we've decriminalized cannabis almost throughout North America now. And that's going to have an impact on the way that people are policed. With the opioid crisis, I feel like we've come to a societal conclusion that the better way to approach the opioid crisis is through a public health lens rather than a criminalization lens. What if we did that for all drug use? Why do we have to criminalize drug use? If people are having a problem where they need support or they need help, let's attack it through a public health lens instead of terrorizing people, arresting them, doing these raids, and subjecting them to violence and brutality. Instead, we can provide support through public health, through people who have done the research on addiction and abuse, and support people who need it. We do not need the police to serve that function.
So I just want to challenge you on a point about this, which is a lot of people are going to hear that and go, okay, what do you mean? So there's 1.7 billion going into funding the Toronto Police Department.
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking like we need to be safe? Like, you know, there's still a need for some degree of policing. I think most people,
but I need you to
many people would feel that way.
But I need you to qualify that. Why? In what, to serve what function?
To keep us safe. If
How?
I'm playing devil's advocate.
How?
Good question.
Yes.
I think they serve, wouldn't people say they serve as, okay, they serve as a threat, but how can we, like right now, we've got Donald Trump, basically, now we're back in America, sorry, I know. And this is not happening in Canada, to be fair. We have, like, you know, in Washington, D.C., the army coming out and flying over citizens. And we have, you know, the police pepper spraying or whatever the heck it is, citizens right outside, who are peacefully demonstrating right outside the White House.
You're a terrible devil's advocate. You were making my arguments.
Who are they working for, and why? They are not keeping you guys safe.
No,
I'm worried about my friends in America now. I'm worried about you.
Chalk that up for an argument for me. You know, like, I think the police are showing us very much right on the street why we don't need them. Like, look, Americans are really intense about their First Amendment freedom of speech, okay? But all of a sudden seems to be a big problem.
But did Trump mention that last night when he went in front of the church and held up the Bible? No, he talked about your Second Amendment rights.
Yeah, he sure did. But honestly, I do want to challenge what, you know, I want to go through that devil's advocate.
Okay, good.
So tell me, if you say, like, I just need you to tell me, I'm sure there's reasons where we can find where the police do something, I don't know, maybe, but if you're saying that they keep us safe and people are going to say we need them to serve some function, I just need you to tell me what that is, and I will poke holes in whatever it is you say. I promise.
Okay. I'm trying to think of examples right now.
I know it's hard, isn't it? It's hard. Because the thing is, though, people who, for most of us who live in middle income and or wealthier communities, right? We already live the life that Black people are requesting to live. You don't interact with police on a regular basis. They're not patrolling your streets. They're not carding you. They're not stopping and frisking you.
Only when I speed, when I'm going too fast. They stop me, and I haven't in years, but when I was a teenager, every now and then I went too fast, and they pulled me over and they said, ma'am, stop it.
So generally, for most people, the police exist as like a fictional option in their head that perhaps they could reach at some point if they find themselves in danger.
Shutting up teenage parties that are too loud next door.
I am telling you that police do not have to be the ones doing that. So I have
absolutely not.
That.
Absolutely not. That could be a social worker.
I think it's in 2016 that Mark Ikamba Boekwa was killed by police after a noise complaint was made in a public housing complex in Mississauga.
Right.
So a noise complaint is made, a bunch of police show up in this suburb of Toronto in Mississauga. And Mark Ikamba Boekwa walks out of his house with a kitchen knife in his hand, and 19 bullets were shot at him from police. 14 of those bullets hit him, he died. 2 of those bullets hit other police officers, and 1 bullet hit a woman who was cutting fruit in her kitchen. I contend to you that in the event of a noise complaint, we do not need a service that shows up with the lethal force to kill you 19 times over to break up a party.
Okay, devil's advocate again. I have 2 points I'd like to make. One is a violent person with a gun and a knife has entered my house and is threatening my kids. I'm sorry, that's comment from Zipporah Berman.
Sure. Yeah.
Number 2, what about subduing the Toronto van attack?
Right, yeah, okay, so there what we're talking about is a particular kind of violent crime. And
Yeah.
so this, I want to say, is a very rare occurrence where there would be an intense violent crime that is ongoing that the police respond to while it is ongoing. Most of the time when police are dealing with violent crime, they're responding to it once the like active threat has disappeared. But I agree that there are situations where there will be an ongoing crime or an ongoing violent situation where we need some sort of violence interruption. I think for that, we can have a much smaller, tactical, very specific service that is specifically there to engage with violence interruption. I don't think it has to look like or be attached to the current state of institutional policing. I have outlined a little bit about that in an article that I just wrote for the Huffington Post that I tweeted out, so I hope people take a look at that. But I do agree that, yeah, we will need...
But I wish you'd written it for National Observer instead.
I'm writing something for you too.
Well, then
did you know that?
Cool.
You guys called,
No, I didn't know.
You called me after the Huffington Post did. So, but don't worry.
The left hand doesn't always know what the right hand's doing.
And I think actually an article came out today that Alistair
Yes, you
wrote.
were quoted in there. Absolutely. Sandy, we have a lot of questions from people that I want to shift now to,
Great.
I think I think people are going to continue to challenge you about this later on, but we have some other kinds of questions.
Okay.
I'd like to wrap up by saying, I would love for you to tell us, not maybe now if you could, but like in an article, how you see the budget, like how would you slice the pie if you had that 1.7 billion? I'd like to know that. Okay, moving on.
You know, I want to do that, okay? Like nobody is paying me enough right now to do all the research, but slowly, I promise to build something like that. There are other groups who already have.
Sure.
You can see it in certain municipalities who, I mean, certainly in LA, there is a alternative people's budget that shows how breaking up the police budget can fund all sorts of different services. And it is something that BLM is working on right now in Toronto, is coming up with how we can reallocate those funds. So yes, I promise to do that, but I volunteer right now, and so I'm doing what I can.
Okay.
The thing is about activists and about policy like this too, is it's like, I can come up with the great ideas. Let's get some policymakers to put them into place. I'm just giving you the underlying principle that shows that this is possible. And there are other ways to think about how we provide these services in our community.
Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting and it's very thought-provoking. We have a question here from Anna Desmarais, who asks, why do you think the reaction of some Canadians to the protests are, quote, we don't have racism like the US? How do we dismantle that idea, this idea of Canadian exceptionalism?
Oh man, I've never heard anyone say Canadian exceptionalism. That's usually something that people say about Americans, and I love it. That's great. Why? That's a very good question. The why is attached to the type of information that Canadians have available to us. For those, for people who are journalists or no journalists who deal with keeping the cops accountable, folks in Canada might be surprised to find out that people in the United States have access to far more accountability information, like names of police officers who commit an infraction or were involved in a case of police brutality, their history of violent interactions with the public. If there's video, the public typically has access to that quite quickly, and so on. In Canada, no right to any of that information. And in fact, journalists have described to me what a difficult time they've had trying to get access to that type of information. When Jermaine Carby was killed in Toronto and when Andrew Loku was killed in Toronto, we didn't get the names of the police officers who did those things until like 2 or 3 years after the incident had taken place. We didn't get any information about the 911 calls. In some cases, there was information about video and evidence. We didn't get that accountability information until much, much later. When we don't have that information, it becomes very difficult for journalists to write about what is going on. And so Canada has had this very long history of hiding information from the public that makes it seem as though things aren't going on. I've heard people talk about how there wasn't, for example, slavery in Canada. Canada has a 200-year history with enslavement of Black people. It's not written in our history books. We didn't keep census information in the same way that America tracked the information of enslaved people. And so people are able to deny it because they can't easily point to the evidence that these things existed. And
where did that happen? Where did that happen?
Enslavement in Canada?
Yeah, where was slavery in Canada?
I mean, throughout Upper Canada and New France, right? So Ontario and Quebec. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this, and this is studied by Afua Cooper, who is a professor out at Dalhousie University, that there was an underground railroad that moved from Canada to the United States for a very similar reason as to why people were moving from the United States to Canada, trying to escape the Fugitive Slave Act. There was a similar law that was passed in Canada, and people were similarly trying to escape the jurisdiction so they could be free in the United States. I mean, people don't know this history because we don't make it easy to find out. And I think that that is intentional. You don't hide 200 years of history by accident. Canada likes to see itself as this mythological place that's just better than the United States, but it's quite frankly false.
Well, I think this is a good moment to talk about, or just mention that how Canada has treated Indigenous people over the last, throughout its history, and the police, many stories of police brutality regarding Indigenous people. So, we can't really have this discussion without at least, without mentioning that and acknowledging that.
Yeah, and I think in both the founding of this country and the United States, it's really important to think about what the historical role is of the police. The police are an institution. Many might be curious to know that the history of the police is that they were a service that was started in France to protect the wealth of wealthy men, protect their property. And one of those things that wealthy men—
That hasn't really changed.
It hasn't changed, actually, it hasn't. And I think that's one of the problems. I think it's an irredeemable institution. One of the types of property that they were trying to protect was the property of enslaved people who would liberate themselves, and then they would become slave catchers and catch them and bring them back to their owners. Now, when you move to the New World, right, and so many enslaved people were required to make settlement possible, the police became essentially slave catchers. And there's a lot of great—
you mean in the North as well as in the North and the South?
Oh yeah, there's some evidence for this that a professor at McGill, his name escapes me, but I will remember before the end of this, has tracked—
I've read about that.
And just to relate this also back to what you were mentioning, like the police serves another purpose in the New World, which was to clear the land for white settlement, which meant literally Indigenous genocide. So that is the origin of the policing institution in Canada and America, eliminating Indigenous people from their land and recapturing enslaved people who had liberated themselves.
Okay, Sandy, what is the best way to support Black Lives Matter from a small town where there are no protests? That's a question from Sarah Humes.
For me, I think what's really important in this moment, I think more than ever before, people are ready to hear a conversation about concrete solutions like defunding the police. I mean, there's a reason why I was able to talk about this on CTV and CBC recently, whereas I think at some point before, people wouldn't have ever been curious to even consider something like that because it sounds so out of this world to some people. I think people really need to listen to what Black communities are saying across North America, and this is the resounding call, and be open to the idea that maybe it makes a lot of sense, and make that idea possible and challenge our policymakers to think about new ways of doing things. I think I always mention the mental health service first because I think it's one of the easiest things to understand. Call your representatives, Tell people at your workplaces, if you're in a union, talk to your union siblings. If you're at a church, talk to people in your church or your synagogue or temple about how this is a possible way forward, to make sure that Indigenous lives and Black lives are not lost as a result of the police continuing to serve these functions that they simply have already proven that they cannot serve well.
Thank you for that. This is a question that we've touched on, but let's go there again. Raven Khadija asks, how can we get people outside of America to stop viewing everything, well, this is a different question actually, everything from the extreme lens of America in order to see the more subtle flow of racism prevalent in our societies? For example, Canada.
I don't know if I understand the question.
Okay.
I think maybe what the question is getting at is that American news like kind of dominates our news cycle, perhaps, and dominates, well, Canadian culture in such a way that we are far more interested in reporting on what's happening in America than contending with the very real problems that we have here. And if that is the way that the question is being posed and what the question is, I think that one of the things that we really have to contend with in Canada is the way that our media landscape is set up. It is, quite frankly, very white. A lot of the people who are doing the production side of things and deciding what's news and what gets reported on are not coming from very diverse communities. When you watch the news at your home, you know, you might notice that people are very diverse. And so yes, they're hiring people who are diverse to be in front of the camera, but it's just as important to hire people who are very diverse to be in the newsroom. I mean, nowhere was this more starkly shown than when Justin Trudeau was going through the blackface scandal, and there was a picture of all the journalists who were asking him questions about the blackface scandal. They were all white. They were all white. And what it does when you diversify a newsroom is it makes other types of knowledges possible. For example, the idea of defunding the police is not a new idea for Indigenous communities. It's not a new idea for Black communities. It's something that's been discussed for so long. For a lot of communities that are not Black and that are not white, perhaps they haven't heard that discussed for a long time. And so it sounds bizarre and weird. But if it sounds bizarre and weird to a community simply because they're not of the same culture, then you're just excusing or excluding, rather, a community from news that really should be a part of creating and deciding the news as well. And so we have a huge representational problem in who decides the news in Canada, and I think that is a huge reason why we often see news from America. Canada likes to position itself as the better America. We're slightly better than them, and that makes us good, and that people are not willing to discuss some of the really hard truths. But I know a bunch of journalists who would be willing to do those things, who don't have permanent positions across Canada's media landscape. I hope that answered the question. I hope that was what the person was getting at.
Thank you, Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
For youth watching everything unfold on television and social media who are feeling helpless and sorrow, how can they help when they feel they can't make any change? That's from Leanna Rockwell.
Well, I think one thing is I think that youth are so important because I think more than a lot of other people or a lot of other groups, demographics in our society, they can really be creative and see themselves outside the constraints of the institutions that currently exist. And so I think it's just really important to understand that when you see that there's something wrong, like everything that is created, that the society that we live in, people created all the services that currently exist as they do now. And that means that they can be changed. Literally anything can be changed. We can rethink anything. And, for me right now, here I am sitting in America in a place where I'm not a citizen. I feel like I can't go to any of the protests because I'm afraid to be deported. And I'm like, what type of power do I really have right now? And in my mind, I'm like, all I want to do is make the idea of defunding the police not so wild and make it as popular as possible. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do as much writing as I can to whoever will listen to me. I'm going to do as much creation as I can to whoever will listen to me. I have my own podcast with Nora Loretto that we created one day when she moved out of the city that we both lived in together, and we were like, well, maybe people will listen to us argue with one another on the air. And you just create your own stuff and see if people take root. And if they don't, just keep trying, because maybe eventually they will. I never thought that people would be taking some of the ideas that I have seriously, but I realized that all it takes is a little bit of determination and belief that, hope against hope that perhaps I can push the Overton window a little bit so that people really do think that this is something that's possible. And if I fail, at least I pushed you. You know what I mean? At least I pushed somebody.
Thanks for that. And this is from Brian Schell, who asks, apart from the cathartic purpose of demonstrating and expressing outrage, why do you think these street tactics will effect lasting change in the underlying causes in Canada of racism, targeting of visible minorities, and economic inequality?
I think that if we look back to any major change that's been made in society, it's because people have taken to the streets and made an idea popular. And we can talk about everything from women's liberation movements to queer liberation movements to movements for Indigenous rights and Black communities' rights and so on. And I think part of that is because when you show that something is really popular, policymakers, for better or for worse, start thinking about their job come next term in terms of an election, or they start wanting to do the right thing. I'm more of a cynic, so I think that usually it's about votes and that type of power. But the getting out onto the streets and making a public demonstration has always been a very effective, very quick way to get something done, especially for a group of people who have been traditionally undervalued by society. And so, I say, let's follow in that tradition. Don't ignore something that's worked, because what we know hasn't worked is appealing to the better judgment, I guess, I don't know, of police officers or policymakers. We've tried reform for decades and it's not working. And so something else needs to be done.
Okay, this is a question from Isabel Douglas. She says, I totally agree that the police should be defunded. I also know that the police associations and unions wield so much power. I remember somebody on the police services board in Toronto, now dismantled, was calling for, if not defunding, at least a decrease to the police budget. She was severely harassed by the police, surveilled and maligned to the point where she had to step down, I believe. My question, therefore, is how do we garner political will to defund the police?
Yeah, so the people power on the street has to be more powerful than the money of the police unions. And that is a big piece that I haven't been talking about a lot in the last couple of days. And I think we really do need to talk about it, because I don't think that a lot of people understand just how powerful these police unions are. And I mean, if that's the only reason why we have the situation that we have, that seems like some gang intimidation stuff that we shouldn't be kowtowing to. That's disgusting. And people should really, really know about it, but there isn't a lot of reporting on the power of police unions and the type of way that they are close with certain types of politicians and how they get certain policies put in place. I don't know what the answer is in terms of weakening them, but I do know that if people on the ground are stronger than them, eventually policymakers, they listen to the people who have the most power if they want to keep their seats. And so I'm like, we got to just make this stuff so popular. It's really important.
These two questions are related, so I'm going to ask them both, and then please, love to hear what your answer is.
Mm-hmm.
Anna Desmarais asks again, what is your advice for non-Black reporters on how to post, tweet, or talk about the Black Lives Matter movement? And then Simran Singh asks, as a journalist, I want to ensure my reporting on stories on Black communities includes and amplifies their voices. However, I also want to be respectful of the fact that Black scholars, creators, thinkers, members of the community do not owe journalists their unpaid labor or explanation, especially during this time. Sandy, what is your advice for journalists on how to approach members of the Black community in a thoughtful and respectful way for interviews?
Well, there's a couple things. One thing is that I do think that people who are full-time journalists working in newsrooms, you should think about telling your producers and editors to just publish Black people altogether. Just say look, I've seen this important tweet or offering on Facebook, a well-written whatever. Wouldn't it be great if we could include this in our publication? Wouldn't it be great if we could include this person on the news? So, relinquish a little bit of the power that you have directly to Black people so that we can speak for ourselves. And in the event that you're covering something, similarly, you're going to see when you are engaging with Black people online right now, a number of things that seem to coalesce into a consensus. One of those things, again, is defunding the police. And you can find those Black people in your local community, because we are everywhere, to talk to. And if you're struggling with coming up with the types of questions that need to be asked, or you're not sure, ask the person who you are interviewing. I've had a few people who interviewed me in the last few days who are like, honestly, I don't know anything about this subject. What is the best way to approach it? And I know that might seem uncomfortable, and we as Black people might be really frustrated to hear that, and you might get some of that frustration back when we respond, but at least you can listen to us still. It might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but listen to us still, because we'll be able to tell you how to appropriately frame the story so that it makes the most sense for what needs to happen and what information the population really needs to know.
Thank you. I want to just bring up Anna's question because it was different. Can you talk about, she asked, can you talk about how to tweet and do social media about Black Lives Matters? What is the right way, I think, particularly for journalists who are not Black?
Well, I mean, the retweet button and the share button are really great because you can just elevate Black voices through, just sharing directly what they're saying and showing, again, popular support for the ideas that Black people are putting forward for how to concretely change the conditions under which we are living. I think that those are some of the most important ways that we can use social media. Social media is such an opportunity for us in this moment to do that. I am kind of an accidental social media success story, I guess. I don't know that I know exactly the ways to make things really popular, but I do think coming from a position of power with respect to race, if you want to support what Black people are saying, just share, retweet, show popular support.
Sandy, we only have 3 minutes left, and I see a bunch of comments that are kind of similar to a bunch of questions, which are pretty much along the lines of, thank you so much, Sandy, for being such a great leader, being willing to speak about this in situations, venues like this. And a final question, which I have to ask you to be short in, well, 3 minutes, you have to answer, from Maria Diaz. How can I best be an ally to the Black community here in Toronto? Thank you, blessings.
And I might sound like a broken record here, but I really do think that it's elevating the voices who are out there, putting themselves out there and saying all the things that we are saying. Share what it is that we're saying, and also please, please, please make the idea of defunding the police popular and possible. Talk to people in your communities about it. Talk to your politicians about it. If you write op-eds or letters to the editor, or make your own content online in any way, and even if it's just communicating with people who are in your social circle. I hope through this webinar that I've been able to demythologize the idea that it's like impossible, and get people really thinking critically about what really is possible if we think about redoing safety in a really good way that does not put Indigenous and Black lives in danger. And so if you want to be an ally and really support that, I need y'all to elevate that message and make it popular.
Sandy, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for all the emotional labor you do and are doing right now, and thank you for joining us. I just want to say again to everyone, we can't do this without thousands of people like you subscribing to nationalobserver.com. So if you haven't already, and you'd like to hear more conversations like these, or you just want to support excellent award-winning journalism, go to nationalobserver.com/subscribe. We've lowered our prices during these times because these are troubling times and these are critical times, and we want to make journalism that informs and is accurate available to as many people as possible. As you see now, as journalists are often putting themselves in harm's way to bring back the story, and that's only one way in which producing factual, verified journalism is really expensive. So please support us with your subscription and stay safe. And Sandy, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.